Talofa lava, this is Pacific Waves from RNZ Pacific. I'm Susana Suisuiki. Coming up, 26 people killed in horrific attacks in East Sepik, Papua New Guinea. Also,
everything that happens in the territory must remain a priority for the state.
New Caledonia MPs meet with French President Macron earlier this week, and
mentality plays a huge part. That's something I've told was coming to the Olympic Village. You've got to be tough mentally because there's going to be a lot of distractions.
Fiji Sevens team remain on track for their third Olympic gold medal. There are calls for support for the survivors of deadly violence in Papua New Guinea. At least 26 people are dead after horrific attacks on villages in Papua New Guinea's East Sepik province earlier this week. A group of about 30 people targeted the villages of Tamara, Tambari and Agumara near the town of Anguram. The suspects are still at large and some survivors have sought shelter in Anguram. Grace Fevereye has the story.
Anguram town resident Andrew Sangi is helping his relatives and others affected by the recent attacks. Mr. Sangi says there are still many survivors who urgently need shelter and assistance.
There are more than 300 to 400 people hiding in the bush with no clothes, nothing to wear, nothing to hide. People are trying their best to help them out there. The government are not really actively involved here to solve this problem.
RNZ Pacific's Papua New Guinea correspondent Scott Wide says police in such remote areas are understaffed and under-resourced.
In Anguram district, police presence is very limited. In some places there are just one reserve policeman or two in locations, so it's difficult for that one person or two people to maintain law and order.
Mr. Bird says political issues are hampering efforts to get crucial aid to people in the communities affected by the violence.
We have so many structural problems in Papua New Guinea. This is one of them, and it becomes glaringly obvious. When you had issues up in Enga province with the killings up there, Enga province faced the same situation. So that we are now currently faced with.
A group of around 30 people suspected of carrying out the attacks remain at large.
The autonomous Papua New Guinea region of Bougainville, which expects to have won its independence by 2027, has now drafted up a new constitution. That document is now being scrutinised throughout Bougainville. One of the people involved in the project as an advisor was Australian constitutional lawyer and academic Anthony Reagan. He told Don Wiseman the 2012 Fiji constitution, overseen by Kenyan academic Yash Gai, and which was later rejected by the Bainimarama regime, has been a key influence over the Bougainville document.
Part of the reason for that was that Yash Gai has been my mentor for the last 40 years, and he brought me in as a member of a three-member panel of experts to assess that draft constitution in early December 2012. So I had a copy of that draft constitution, which is now very difficult to obtain. So I had a copy and I provided that to the drafter, who was not aware of it, other than she was aware of it as a thing, but had never seen it. And she was deeply impressed by it. And much of the idea in it was of great interest to the Bougainville Constitutional Planning Commission as well. There are many other sources, Kenya, Papua New Guinea itself, and a range of other sources, but the Fiji one was significant.
But the Bougainville one does differ, as I understand it, or at least as far as the draft goes. There's a lot of emphasis on the handling of land, resources and the environment.
Yes, it does. That was given a fair bit of attention in Fiji as well, but for very different reasons, because of the history of land issues in the racially divided, ethnically divided situation of Fiji. Bougainville is much more focused on dealing with the legacy of the mine and the exclusion of landowners from involvement in that.
How do you write environmental issues into the Constitution?
You are speaking as a New Zealander, I think. You can write anything into a constitution. The American tradition of constitutions is to have them very short. That's not the tradition that's developed now in post-colonial situations. Not so much with their original constitutions when they became independent. They tended to be fairly bare bones constitutions, particularly in the British system, not quite so much in the French. But after the initial constitutions, when things went bad and there was lots of conflict and other problems in the post-colonial states, they tended to develop much more comprehensive constitutions that sought to deal with the problems that they'd inherited from the colonial period. Papua New Guinea was one that was making its constitution quite late in the post-colonial period. The post-colonial constitution making started in the late 1940s with India, and then Africa and some of them in the 50s, and then in the 60s. Papua New Guinea developed theirs in 1972 to 1974 period. And they learned a great deal from the post-colonial constitutions that had been developed post-independence, and they developed a very long and detailed constitution, and that dealt quite a bit with the environment, because even then in the early 70s, environmental issues were becoming quite significant. So if a country sees environment as a big problem, it deals with it in various ways in the constitution. There are modern constitutions where there's very specific rights of the environment to protection. So what they've done in Bougainville is not very dramatically different from a lot of others.
Right across the Bougainville region, there were consultations, but how much of a say did the ordinary Bougainvillean get?
I've been involved in participatory constitution making in a number of places. I worked for 3 years in Uganda on their constitution. What happens with people giving their views about constitutions is that usually they don't have a great deal of knowledge about what can go in a constitution. People tend to think that a constitution, when it's being made, provides the opportunity to sort out all of their immediate problems. And so they tend to have a lot of policy type recommendations given to them. But if you think carefully about what you're being told by ordinary people in this way, they give you a real picture about what the real problems of a country are. You then tend to try and design your constitution to a large extent around that picture. That doesn't mean that people don't have strong views about particular issues. For example, in Bougainville, corruption and mismanagement in the public sector was a strong theme coming through, and that's now being heavily reflected in the Constitution. So there are a number of things like that where people's views did have a significant impact. Another one would be the role of customary authority, land and environment, as you're saying. The Constitution-making Commission is heavily influenced by what it heard from the people.
Now, the ABG legislature has got this quite remarkable situation where they have 3 seats reserved for women, 3 seats reserved for former militants. My impression was, at the beginning, that was a transitory thing, that they were going to be done away with at some point. But I get the impression from what I've seen of the draft that those seats will stay for, well, some time.
Yes, the women's seats, there was never any intention that they would be time limited necessarily. The ex-combatants, the proposal in the 2004 Constitution was that they should cease after the referendum was held. So it was felt at that time that the ex-combatants should have a role in ensuring that things did happen in accordance with the peace agreement, because there was some uncertainty in people's minds about whether a referendum really would occur, and it was felt that they had in some ways a right to be involved. When the preparations were being made for the 2020 elections after the referendum, there was a move to remove the ex-combatant seats going forward, and that move was defeated by an amendment in the Constitution. That was defeated, and they were kept. There's never been a further revision, a further consideration of that.
There will have to be at some point, of course, because you're going to run out of former combatants.
Indeed, at some point in the future. It's a bit of a surprise that that was agreed to go forward in the Independence Constitution if it's eventually adopted. And the thinking was that it would now become veterans, and that other veterans, such as of the police, and possibly if there's a Bougainville defence force of some sort established, then that they might be also eligible for those seats. But it's still a little bit unclear how that will all work out. Yes. What you have in May, of course, is a first draft, and that's now under review through a widespread consultation process. And I don't know what the reaction of the ordinary people will be to the continuation of those seats. That could get revised. I think the women's seats are most unlikely to be abolished anyway. anyway. I think they're most likely to go forward.
What sort of feedback has there been, if any, from the rest of PNG?
Not a great deal publicly. I think there's quite a bit of discussion on social media, which is very mixed, as you might imagine. From what I'm hearing, I don't follow social media very closely, but that's what people tell me. There's been very little comment in the press. It's a bit unclear so far. The public debate about the future of Bougainville is rather muted.
Talks between pro- and anti-independence parties in New Caledonia could resume in September. And France Info reports that the provincial elections in the French territory, scheduled to be held in mid-December, could be postponed. 4 New Caledonian MPs met with the French President Emmanuel Macron in Paris, calling for political dialogue to resume urgently. Margot Staunton has more.
Photographs of them posing with Mr Macron outside the Elysee Palace emerged this week in an apparent show of unity over the territory, which has been gripped by violent civil unrest for more than 2 months. Attending the meeting were 2 pro-independence MPs, Robert Howie and Emmanuel Chibao, first pro-independence New Caledonian political candidate to win a seat since 1986. Anti-independence MPs Nicolas Metzdorf and Georges Naturel were also present. Mr Chibao has also asked the state for a clear position on the proposed electoral reform bill. The bill was suspended last month by Mr Macron due to the dissolution of the French National Assembly and the subsequent holding of snap elections. Mr Howie says the crisis in New Caledonia has to be a key priority for the state. His comments have been translated.
Despite the elections, the dissolution, the Olympic Games and the establishment of the government, everything that happens in the territory must remain a priority for the state.
Mr Chibao echoed his sentiments.
We need to break the institutional deadlock, the impasse that has occurred over the crisis that affects everyone, whether we are pro or anti-independence.
Loyalist MP Nicolas Metzdorf says it was important for the MPs to show up to the meeting together.
We wanted to show the President how urgent the situation is and emphasise that day-to-day affairs there are far from suitable.
Metzdorf adds that Mr Macron wants to prolong the provincial elections.
We need to give the territory time to resume talks and to restore calm.
Fellow loyalist Georges Naturel says they presented a model for the resumption of dialogue in Noumea.
We must do the same thing with the collegiate government of New Caledonia because our fellow citizens expect concrete things from us. The priority of priorities is to return to order. Freedom of movement is needed. The President reassured us that he will take the steps to do so.
He says that Mr Macron will set up a team to monitor economic issues in the coming weeks.
The Fiji Sevens rugby team looked to make history at the Paris Olympics over the weekend. They're hoping to secure their 3rd consecutive gold medal. Other Pacific athletes and teams will also be in action as the game's opening ceremony gets underway on Saturday. Grace Fevereye has more.
The Fijians defending their Olympic Games Sevens rugby gold medal held off Ireland to win 19-15 in their quarter-final clash on Friday, earning them a spot in the semi-finals with Australia. Fiji's win called for a mini-celebration as heard by the school students in Suva. Coach Colini Sau says mental toughness is what got them through against Ireland, and he believes that it's critical for his players as they head into the medal playoffs on Sunday.
Make sure that we switch on at the right moment. Mentality plays a huge part. That's something I've told the boys coming to the Olympic Village. We're going to be tough mentally because there's going to be a lot of distractions.
Captain Tuwai, who was playing in his 3rd Olympics in a row, backs his coach and says mental fitness is a must for them now.
I think it's not just for us, but for the teams. Mentally, we can shut down. It's a big one of the biggest sports in the world.
Meanwhile, the Samoa Sevens rugby team will fight off for 9th spot, following 2 good wins on Friday morning, having faced a challenging start with 2 losses to Australia and Argentina to record 2 wins against Kenya and Japan. They dominated Kenya 26-0 in their third Pool A match and secured a resounding 42-7 win against Japan in the playoff for the 9th to 12th positions. They face Kenya again on Sunday following Kenya's victory over Uruguay earlier today. Hosts France and South Africa will meet in the other semi-final. Favourites Argentina, Ireland and New Zealand are all out of medal contention after losing their quarterfinals on Friday morning.
The 12th and final team to qualify. South Africa has stunned New Zealand and they will play for a medal here in Paris. A quite staggering upset, make no bones. A big upset. South Africa.
And in other sports, some of the Pacific Islands athletes will be flying their country's colours as their respective competition rolls off following the opening ceremony. This includes archery, women's rugby, badminton, boxing, sailing and surfing, which will run over the next 5 days.
That's Pacific Waves for today. To listen back, head over to rnz.co.nz/Pacific. We're also on Spotify, Apple and iHeartRadio. From myself and the RNZ Pacific team, Tofa Soifua.